She fired him at 8:47 in the morning. By 9:15, he was the only reason her daughter was still alive. Vivian Marlowe ran a billion-dollar empire with an iron hand and a sharper tongue. She'd never been wrong about people, not once, until the quiet man she dismissed without a second glance turned out to be the most dangerous and most decent person in her world. This is the story of a woman who thought she saw everything clearly, and the man nobody saw at all. If stories about loyalty, sacrifice, and the people we almost destroy before we understand them speak to you, subscribe right now. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because what happens in the next 2 hours will stay with you for a very long time. The garage beneath Whitmore Capital smelled like cold concrete and exhaust, the way every parking structure in the city did in November, a little damp, a little sour, by fluorescent tubes that buzzed just quietly enough that you stopped hearing them after a while. Most mornings it was unremarkable, a place you passed through, a place you didn't think about. Ethan Rourke had been thinking about it for 3 years, obsessively, not with any grand purpose. Just the way a man with his particular training thought about every space he occupied, exits, blind spots, sight lines, which pillars were structural and which were decorative, where a person could hide if they needed to, where a person could be hidden if someone else needed them to be. He stood beside the black Mercedes at 8:31 a.m., 16 minutes before his scheduled pickup, because he was always 16 minutes early. His navy jacket was pressed. His shoes were clean. His face gave nothing away. He was 32 years old, though most people who met him guessed older, because he looked worn out. Exactly. More because he had the kind of stillness that takes years to develop, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from having been in enough situations where losing your calm gets people killed. There was a photograph in his left breast pocket. A little girl with a gap-toothed smile and her father's dark eyes, standing in front of a school bus with her backpack hanging crooked off one shoulder. 6 years old and completely convinced that pancakes were a perfectly acceptable dinner food, which Ethan had mostly stopped arguing about. He checked his watch, adjusted it slightly, though it hadn't needed adjusting. Upstairs, Vivian Marlowe was about to ruin both their mornings. Vivian was already in the back seat before the elevator doors finished opening, her phone pressed to her ear and a leather portfolio balanced across her knees. She was 30 years old and had been running Whitmore Capital for 4 of them, which meant she had spent 4 years being underestimated in conference rooms by men twice her age and had learned to enter every space like she already owned it. Most of the time she did. Move the Hargrove meeting to 11, she said into the phone, not looking up. And tell Tividson he either commits to the numbers by Thursday or we find another partner. Tensions. She clicked off, glanced at her watch, glanced at the route on the navigation screen, and frowned. This isn't Meridian Avenue. Ethan met her eyes briefly in the rearview mirror. There's a water main break near 5th and Meridian. 3-block closure. I took Harrington instead should have you there in roughly the same time. I take Meridian Avenue every morning. Yes, ma'am. This morning Meridian's closed. Vivian looked up from her portfolio for the first time. Her expression wasn't angry. Exactly. It was the precise, considered look of a person organizing a decision. I didn't authorize a route change. You were on a call. I made the judgment. I don't pay you to make judgments about my route. Ethan didn't argue. He had long ago understood the kind of person Vivian Marlowe was, not cruel, but relentlessly structured. She operated inside a framework she had built herself, and any deviation from it, however small, felt to her like cracks forming in the foundation. He knew the type. He had served under officers like her. Some of them were brilliant. All of them were exhausting. Understood, he said. Pull over. He glanced in the mirror again. Ms. Marlowe, pull over Mr. Rourke. He pulled to the curb. Vivian was already dialing her assistant. Ethan sat with hands on the wheel and waited, which was something he was genuinely good at. Send a car from the building pool, Vivian said into the phone. Yes, immediately. She lowered the phone and looked at him directly, for what might have been only the 2nd or 3rd time in 3 years. You're terminated, effective this morning. Collect your belongings from the garage. HR will handle the paperwork. She said it the way she might cancel a lunch reservation. Without consideration, just without hesitation. Ethan turned off the engine. Set the keys on the center console. Okay, just that. Okay. He got out, stood on the sidewalk in the November cold while she transferred to another vehicle, and then he walked back toward the building because his personal items were still in the garage locker. Lily's photograph was already with him. The rest of it was just a jacket and a water bottle, and a book he'd been reading too slowly because he kept falling asleep during Lily's bedtime stories. He took the stairs back down, force of habit, and that was when he heard the sound. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about moments like that, they rarely were. No music rising, no obvious signal that the ordinary world was tipping into something else. It was just a small noise, the sound a child makes when they're trying not to cry and failing at it, that choked, hitching quality. That means the fear is too large to hold in. Ethan stopped walking. He turned his head slightly to the left and let the rest of his senses do what his eyes couldn't. The garage was loud with engine noise and the low hum of the ventilation system, and the sound dampened and scattered between concrete columns in ways that made distance hard to judge. But it came again, clearer this time. A child, near the east wall. He did not run. Running announces you. He moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent years learning. That speed is not the same thing as urgency. You can be fast without looking fast, and the difference sometimes determines everything. He cleared the third row of vehicles and saw them. 5 men, 1 child. Sophie Marlowe was 8 years old. Ethan had seen her twice. Once when Vivian had him pick her up from a school event. Once when she'd ridden along to a weekend appointment. He'd her mother's posture and her mother's stubbornness, but softer the way children carry qualities before they harden into personality. She was wearing her school uniform, and her hair was in 2 braids, and one of the men had his hand on her arm, and she was pulling back from him with everything she had, which wasn't much, because she was 8 and he was not. The SUV was backed against the service door, unmarked, dark. The engine was running. 3 of the men were positioned between her and the main garage, blocking sights from the entrance cameras. They knew the layout. They had planned this. Ethan noted the exits, the positions, noted that 2 of the men were standing close enough to each other that they would get in each other's way if things moved fast. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He did not call 911 first. He would, in 60 seconds he would. But 60 seconds was enough time to do what needed doing. And if he called first and waited, Sophie was in that SUV and gone before anyone arrived. He knew how these operations worked. He had run versions of them in service of very different objectives, in places most people had never heard of. He set his phone to dial and placed it in his jacket pocket with the screen showing so the call would go through automatically. Then he walked toward them. Hey, his voice came out flat and casual, like a man who had stumbled across something he wasn't sure he understood. The nearest man turned mid-30s, thick through the shoulders, the wary expression of someone who had been trained to assess threats quickly. Ethan was a man in a pressed driver's jacket, carrying no visible weapon, walking without urgency toward 5 of them. The man relaxed slightly. Wrong read. Private area, the man said. Building maintenance. Move along. That's not a maintenance uniform, Ethan said. A half-second of silence. In that half-second, Ethan moved. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean or choreographed. It was not the kind of thing that looks impressive from the outside, because real violence almost never does. It was sharp and economical and extremely unpleasant, and Ethan took a hit to his left shoulder in the first 5 seconds that he immediately knew was going to cause him significant problems, an old injury, a rotator cuff that had been repaired twice, and was never quite right after either time. And he felt something give in a way that narrowed his vision briefly and sent a white-hot line of pain down his arm. He kept moving. He put the first man down with a controlled strike that took him out of the problem for long enough. The second man was faster and smarter, caught Ethan from the side, and for a moment they were struggling between 2 parked cars, and Ethan's left arm was beginning to lose reliable function, which meant he was working with one good arm against a man who didn't know that yet, and that asymmetry was something he could still use. He used it. The third man made the decision to get Sophie into the SUV instead of joining the fight, and Ethan pulled free and threw himself sideways to block the vehicle door before she could be pushed inside. Sophie stumbled against him. He put her behind him and set his feet. The man who appeared to be in charge had not moved. He'd been watching, evaluating. Now he stepped forward. "Your driver," he said. Not a question. Dismissive. The way people say things when they are trying to understand why the world isn't behaving the way it should. "I was," Ethan said. His left arm was hanging wrong, and the pain was a constant presence now, rather than a sharp one, which was actually more concerning. Sophie was pressed against the car door behind him. She was shaking, but she was quiet. "Smart kid." "Step away," the man said. "This doesn't involve you anymore." "Sophie." Ethan kept his voice level, kept his eyes on the man in front of him. "I need you to count to 10 in your head and then yell as loud as you've ever yelled in your life. Okay?" "Okay," Sophie whispered. The man lunged. Ethan was already moving. When the police arrived 4 minutes and 17 seconds after Ethan's pocket-dialed call connected, and the dispatcher heard enough to send units, immediately they found the following: 2 men zip-tied to a structural pillar using materials sourced from a nearby maintenance cart. 1 man unconscious beside a dark SUV. 1 man with a broken wrist sitting against the east wall, pressing his head between his knees. The 5th man, the leader, was being held face down on the concrete by a person the officers initially was a security professional of some kind, pressed there by a knee and 1 functioning arm, the other arm hanging at an angle that made 2 of the arriving officers wince. Sophie Marlowe was sitting on the hood of a parked car, wearing a navy jacket that was much too large for her, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the scene with enormous eyes. She was not hurt. She was not crying anymore. She was doing the particular thing that children sometimes do after a period of extreme fear, becoming very, very still, like if they hold still long enough, the world will stop being frightening. Lead detective Marcus Shaw approached the man, holding the last attacker down. He took 1 look at the arm and said, "Sir, you need to let us take over." "Me too," Ethan said. His voice was even, which was impressive given the circumstances. He stood up slowly, accepted Shaw's steadying hand without comment. "That's so you did good," he told her. That yell at the end. Really committed to it. Sophie's mouth moved towards something that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction. Shaw looked at the arm again. "Sir, who are you?" Ethan reached into his breast pocket with his right hand and pulled out Lily's photograph instead of any ID, looked at it for a moment as though reminding himself of something, and then put it back. "I used to work here," he said. Vivian arrived 11 minutes later. She had been in the lobby of a building 6 blocks away when her phone rang with Sophie's nanny's number, and the call hadn't connected properly. Just 3 seconds of background noise, and then nothing, and something in Vivian's chest had gone cold and entirely instinctual in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel. She had been back in a car and moving before she consciously decided to move. When the elevator opened into the garage, the scene that met her was lit by 3 police units and a responding ambulance, and there were people in uniforms moving with the organized urgency of people who had arrived after the fact and were now managing consequences. Her eyes went to Sophie first immediately, completely, and didn't leave her for a long moment. Sophie was okay. She was on a car hood being spoken to gently by a female officer, still wrapped in a jacket that wasn't hers. Okay. She was okay. Vivian crossed the garage with a stride that the detective later described in his notes as the kind of walk that parts crowds without trying, and she gathered her daughter from the car hood and held her. Sophie made a sound that landed somewhere in Vivian's chest that no amount of professional composure could touch. "I'm here," Vivian said. "I've got you." "There was a man," Sophie said against her shoulder. "He helped me." Vivian pulled back slightly to look at her daughter's face. "What man?" Sophie pointed. Across the garage, sitting on a crate near the ambulance, with a paramedic cutting his jacket sleeve to access his left shoulder, was Ethan Rourke. He was looking at the floor, not at her. His right hand was braced on his knee and his jaw was set. People set their jaw when something hurts considerably and they are not planning to admit it. Vivian stared at him. The man she had fired at 8:47 that morning. Yes, Chi, the driver she had dismissed in approximately 90 seconds without asking a single question about who he was or how he had come to be standing in her garage every morning for 3 years. She handed Sophie carefully to the nanny who had caught up behind, walked across the garage. Mr. Rourke. He looked up. His face registered something not quite surprise, not quite satisfaction. Acknowledgement. Ms. Marlowe. Are you? She stopped. Question felt absurd, given what she was looking at. Sophie says you helped her. Ethan glanced toward where Sophie was now being held by the nanny, and something in his expression changed in a way that was so brief, Vivian almost missed it. She stayed calm, he said. That's why it worked. Kid didn't panic. You're deflecting credit to my 8-year-old. She earned it. Vivian stood there for a moment. Paramedic asked her to give them some room, and she stepped back, watching as they examined the shoulder, watching Ethan's face stay professionally neutral during what appeared to be a painful assessment, and she was aware, suddenly, of the photograph in his pocket and the fact that she had worked beside this man for 3 years and did not know he had a daughter, did not know anything about him, actually. She had never thought to ask. Detective Shaw appeared at her elbow. Ms. Marlowe, we're going to need a full statement from you, from Sophie, when she's ready, and from your security staff. There's a lot we need to sort out. Yes, Vivian didn't look away from Ethan. What do you know about him? Shaw's expression shifted slightly. More than we expected. Former Navy SEAL, 8 years of service. Medically transitioned out. According to our initial check, he's been driving for your company for about 3 years. He paused, as though choosing how to put the next part. The way he handled 5 trained operatives with what appears to be a pre-existing shoulder injury and no weapon, that's not driving school. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She said finally, I don't suppose it is. The investigation moved quickly once it got moving, and what it uncovered in the first 48 hours was the kind of thing that made Vivian feel the floor shift slightly under her feet, not physically, but in the deeper sense of discovering that the world you thought you understood is structured differently than you believed. Kidnappers were not random. They were organized, professional, and specifically informed. They had known Sophie's school schedule. They had known the garage layout, known the camera positions and the service entrance access codes. And they had known, to within a 15-minute window, when Ethan Rourke would no longer be in that garage. That last detail was the one that settled coldest. Detective Shaw delivered it in Vivian's conference room with the directness she appreciated, even though it hit like ice water. Timing of his termination wasn't coincidental. Miss Marlowe communicated it. Someone communicated it. Someone who knew what Rourke was capable of decided the operation should happen after he was gone. Vivian sat with that for a moment. They knew who he was, she said. They respected what he was, Shaw said. Enough to build their timeline around him, which meant someone inside her company, inside the structure she had built and believed in, people she had personally evaluated, had looked at her quiet driver and understood something that Vivian herself had entirely failed to see. The irony of that did not escape her. She spent the evening alone in her office, which she almost never did. She sat with the particular discomfort of a person who is genuinely, comprehensively wrong and knows it. She had been wrong about Ethan. She had been wrong about the people around her. And her daughter had spent 40 terrifying minutes in a garage because of both errors combined. Called him the following morning. He picked up on the second ring. I have a request, she said, without preamble, because neither of them had ever been the type for long warm-up conversations. Okay, Ethan said. I'd like you to come back. Not as my driver. As a security consultant. We have a leak. Somewhere in the organization, the investigators are working on it, but they need someone who understands. She stopped, refreshed. I need someone who sees things I'm missing, who has the particular training to understand how this happened and make sure it doesn't happen again. Silence on the line, not an uncomfortable silence. Kind where someone is thinking seriously rather than stalling. Sophie's schedule gets reviewed, he said finally. Security around her needs to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. Agreed. And I have a daughter. His voice didn't change inflection, but the weight of it shifted slightly. 6 years old. Her name is Lily. She goes to school at Fairview Elementary, and she has a doctor's appointment on Thursdays, and sometimes she gets scared of the dark, and she is the first priority in everything I do. Before your company, before your schedule, before anything that comes up. She comes first. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I understand. Yes, he'd intervened. I need more than I understand. I need it to be the actual operating condition of whatever arrangement we're making. Then that's what it is, Vivian said. Another pause. "'Kay," Ethan said again. "I'll come in tomorrow." Vivian lowered the phone after the call ended and sat at her desk and thought, not for the first time, about how many things she had learned in the past 48 hours that she should have known years ago. What it cost to look at people and see only their function rather than their whole. She thought about Ethan's face when he'd glanced toward Sophie across that garage, the thing that moved in his expression, and then was gone. She thought about a man who left one of the hardest careers in the world to make pancakes with his daughter, and then drove the cars of people like her because it was steady and it was safe, and it let him be home before 6. He'd intervened. She had fired him for changing a route. She went home that evening and checked on Sophie 3 times, which was 2 more times than she would normally have allowed herself. At Fairview Elementary, across the city, yet Ethan Rourke was at a school pickup in a jacket with one sleeve cut off, his left arm in a temporary sling, explaining to his daughter that no, he was fine. Yes, it hurt a little. They could not have pizza for dinner 4 nights in a row, even if she made a compelling argument for it. Lily examined his sling with the serious gravity of a person half her age. "Did you do something brave?" she asked. Ethan crouched down to her level, which required some careful maneuvering with the shoulder. "I did something that needed doing," he said. "There's a difference. But you're okay? I'm okay." She thought about that. Then she nodded once, satisfied, and took his right hand and led him toward the car. "We can have pizza tomorrow," she said generously. "That's very kind," Ethan said. He held her hand and walked her to the car in the November cold. The photograph in his pocket had a small wrinkle in the corner from where he'd pressed his thumb against it too many times that morning, and the shoulder ached with every step. It was the best part of his day by a significant distance. Behind him, the city went on being the city. Loud and ordinary and entirely indifferent to what had happened that morning in a parking garage, the near thing, the close call, moment that could have broken several lives, and hadn't, barely. Ethan buckled Lily into her seat, winced through it, accepted her critical commentary on the buckle with patience, and got in the driver's seat. He didn't think about Vivian Marlowe. He didn't think about Sophie, though he was glad she was home and safe. Yes, he'd intervened. He didn't think about the men currently sitting in holding cells or the leak inside a company he was about to help investigate. He thought about what Lily had said to him once when she'd had a hard day at school, and he'd asked how she was doing. "Now that you're here," he started the car. "Better now." Ethan showed up the next morning at 7:45, which was 15 minutes before Vivian had told him to come in, because being on time and being early were 2 different things, and he had never fully made peace with just being on time. His left arm was in a proper sling, now a black neoprene thing the hospital had fitted him with, after the x-rays confirmed what he'd already known from the specific quality of the pain. The rotator cuff had torn again, worse than the second time. Not quite as bad as it could have been. The surgeon had used the phrase impressively stubborn tissue, and then immediately clarified that this was not a compliment. He took the elevator this time. The stairs felt like unnecessary theater with the shoulder. The lobby of Whitmore Capital looked exactly the way it always had: marble floors, clean lines, reception desk staffed by a woman who had checked him in 300 times over 3 years, and now looked at him with an expression that didn't know what category to put him in. The driver anymore. Not exactly an executive. Something in between that didn't have a name yet. "Mr. Rourke," she said carefully. "Morning," he said, and signed in. Waitin'. Vivian's assistant, a young man named Derek, who had always been professionally courteous to Ethan, in the way that assistants are courteous to drivers pleasantly, from a slight distance came down personally to collect him, which was itself a small signal about how things had shifted. They rode up to the 14th floor without conversation, which suited Ethan fine. He spent the ride noting that the elevator had one camera positioned at an angle that left the lower right corner essentially blind. He made a mental note. Old habits. Vivian was already in her conference room when he arrived, along with Detective Shaw and two people from a federal financial crimes unit whose names Ethan caught and stored without making a production of it. There was coffee on the table, a whiteboard on the wall with a rough organizational chart drawn in red marker. Surveillance photos from the garage, printed and laid out in a row. Vivian stood when he came in, which surprised him. She was not the type to stand. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said 7:45, he said, sitting down, because acknowledging the gesture felt like it would make both of them uncomfortable. Shaw gave him a brief nod across the table. They had spoken twice since the garage, and Shaw had the quality that Ethan respected in investigators. He listened more than he talked, and he didn't pretend to know things he didn't know. "We've been laying out what we have," Shaw said, "which is less than I'd like. The men from the garage are not talking in any useful direction. Organized, well-coached. The SUV was a dead-end stolen 3 weeks ago, cleaned. The operation was professional," Ethan said. "The people they sent weren't, particularly. Whoever planned it was. That's our read, too." Ethan looked at the surveillance photos. The parking garage from 4 angles, time-stamped from the morning of the attack. He studied them for a moment, the way he studied things, not rushing to conclusions, just letting the details settle. "Pull the footage from the 2 weeks before this," he said. "Just the garage. Service entrances, delivery logs. Anyone who came in on a maintenance or contractor basis." One of the federal agents looked at him with mild curiosity. "We've already requested her," Ethan said, not unkindly. "Whoever planned this walked the space beforehand. Always do. And if they were careful enough to know the camera blind spots, they weren't careful enough in every other way. But he is." Vivian was watching him from across the table, but didn't address it. "We also need to talk about Sophie's schedule," Ethan said. "Who had access to it?" The room went slightly quieter, in the way rooms do when a subject nobody wants to say out loud gets said out loud. Vivian sat down. "Her school, obviously. My personal assistant. My calendar system. A handful of senior staff who coordinate my personal appointments." "That's a larger group than it sounds like," Ethan said. "I need names and access levels." "I'll get you everything," Vivian said. "And the termination." He said it flatly without inflection, because it was simply a data point that needed to be addressed. Shaw mentioned the timing wasn't coincidental. That means someone knew I was being let go within a window, narrow enough to be operationally useful. Vivian's jaw tightened fractionally. "I told Derek to arrange the HR paperwork on my way to the elevator. It was approximately 10 minutes before." "Derek," one of the federal agents wrote the name down, Vivian said, and she said it with the particular certainty of someone who had made this mistake before with other people, and was being careful not to make it again with this one. Then she stopped, and Ethan watched her decide, visibly, not to be certain. "I don't believe it was Derek," she amended. "But I acknowledge I could be wrong. Investigate him along with everyone else." It cost her something to say that. He could see it. Vivian Marlowe had built her entire professional identity on the quality of her judgment about people, and the past 48 hours had been a systematic dismantling of that confidence in a way that left marks. He didn't say anything sympathetic because she wouldn't have wanted that. He moved on. "Okay," he said. "Let's go through the organizational chart." They were there for 3 hours. By the end of it, Ethan had a working list of 11 people whose access levels and positions put them in the possible range of the leak. He had a separate shorter list of 3 who concerned him more than the others, not because of anything conclusive, because of behavioral patterns in the footage Shaw had already pulled, small inconsistencies in access logs, and one detail that nobody else had flagged. A senior executive named Graham Keller had badged into the building's server room 4 times in the past month, which was notable because Graham Keller's role had nothing to do with servers. "People badge into the wrong rooms sometimes," the federal agent said. 4 times in 1 month is a pattern, Ethan said. "Look at what days those were, and cross-reference them against Sophie's schedule updates." Shaw was already writing it down. When the meeting broke, Vivian walked Ethan to the elevator herself, which she did not need to do, and which Shaw and the federal agents clearly noted. They stood in the hallway, outside the conference room, and the building moved around them, phones ringing somewhere, a printer running, the ordinary machinery of a company continuing to operate while its foundation quietly cracked. You should be resting that shoulder, Vivian said. Fine. The surgeon said, I know what the surgeon said. He looked at her directly. How is Sophie? Vivian's expression shifted into something more honest than her professional face. She slept in my bed last night. Woke up twice. She's going to her therapist this afternoon. A pause. She asked me this morning if the man who helped her was okay. Ethan nodded once. She's talking about it, Vivian said, which is good, apparently. Better than going quiet. He said. It is. They stood there a moment in the slightly awkward way of two people who are not quite what they were to each other 24 hours ago and have not yet established what they are now. I'll need a workspace, Ethan said. Somewhere I can access the security feeds directly. And I'll need it arranged so I can leave by 3, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Told you, Vivian said. Lily comes first. That wasn't a negotiating position. He studied her for a moment, looking for the qualification buried in it, the fine print. He didn't find it, which did not mean it wasn't there. But it did mean she was either telling the truth or very good at the performance of it. And in his experience, those two things eventually became distinguishable. All right, he said. He took the elevator down. In the lobby, the receptionist watched him come across to the exit and said, no, almost to herself, different badge now. Ethan glanced at the new security badge clipped to his jacket. Consulting. Different job, he said. He walked out into the November air, phone already out, calling the woman who watched Lily in the afternoons to let her know he'd be running later than usual today. The shoulder throbbed in the cold. He'd had worse. The workspace Vivian set up for him was a small office off the main security hub on the 3rd floor, functional, no windows, the kind of room that had probably been a storage space for something before someone put a desk in it. Ethan liked it fine. He didn't need windows. He needed the 6-monitor security feed set up and fast access to the building's access logs, both of which were there. He spent the first 4 days doing what he'd done in 16 countries over 8 years. Building a picture, rushing to it, just accumulating detail with the patience of someone who understood that the picture you build too fast is usually missing the most important things. He reviewed footage. He cross-referenced logs. He built a timeline of Graham Keller's movements against the operational timeline of the kidnapping. And by the end of the 4th day, the picture was clear enough that he brought it to Shaw. Shaw looked at the timeline for a long time. That's not conclusive, he said finally. Ethan agreed. But it's enough to get you a warrant for his communications. You think he knew about the server room camera? I think he checked whether there was one and found out there wasn't. Body puts a camera in a room that small with no external access. It was the one place he could meet someone without being on record. Shaw was quiet for another moment. The maintenance worker he met in there. We have him on the service entrance log. 3 times, Ethan said. Same 6-hour window as the Keller visits. Maintenance company listed as real, but when you call their office, nobody there has record of a work order for this building on those dates. Shaw looked up. You yesterday. Ethan. Shaw set down the papers. You understand you're a consultant. You're not. I know what I am, Ethan said. You can pretend you didn't hear the part about the phone call and just use the information. Shaw considered this for approximately 3 seconds. What's the name on the maintenance log? Ethan slid a piece of paper across the desk. Shaw read it, picked up his own phone. The warrant came through on a Wednesday. By Thursday evening, federal investigators had Graham Keller's communications going back 4 months, and what they found in those communications was not subtle. There was an intermediary, a shell account, carefully managed but not carefully enough, and a financial trail that connected to a series of wire transfers that connected, with one more step, to a company registered in a state where Damien Voss held controlling interest. Vivian found out at 6:30 on Thursday evening, which was after Ethan had left to pick up Lily from her Thursday afternoon doctor's appointment, and therefore was not there to see it. Shaw told her in her office. He told her carefully. Way experienced detectives learn to deliver information that will hit people hard, not softening it. Because softening it doesn't help, but pacing it. letting each piece settle for adding the next. Graham Keller had been with Whitmore Capital for 9 years. He had been at Vivian's side through the first funding rounds, through the years when the company was something people bet against, through the growth that eventually proved those wrong. No, she had promoted him twice. She had trusted his read on personnel decisions. She had at various points considered him genuinely loyal. He had been passing to Damien Voss for 4 months, just Sophie's schedule, client strategy, acquisition targets, internal financial projections. When Shaw finished, Vivian sat very still. Is he now? She asked. Federal custody, as of an hour ago. She nodded. Her hands were flat on the desk. Who else? We're working on that. There's a second person in your security department lower level, access to physical entry systems. We're close. Vivian nodded again. Then she said, I promoted Graham based on my read of him. I was wrong. People are wrong about it. I fired my driver because he changed a route. Kept a man for 9 years who was systematically betraying everything I built. She said it in the particular tone of someone who needs to say a thing out loud because saying it out loud makes it impossible to not face. Those two things happened in the same organization. My organization. Shaw didn't say anything sympathetic. He had the intelligence to recognize that she didn't want that. The man who found this, she said. Rourke. He was right about Keller by day 4. Was right, Shaw confirmed. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she thanked Shaw, and when he left, she sat alone in her office for a while, reviewing documents, taking calls, just sitting, which was not something Vivian Marlowe did. She thought about something Ethan had said on the first morning, looking at the organizational chart. She'd asked him how he would approach the investigation, and he had said, yet very simply, I'm going to start with what I can see and work toward what people are trying to keep me from seeing. The gap between those two things is usually where the truth is. She had found that answer slightly cold at the time. She thought it might be the most honest thing anyone in that room had said. Friday morning, Ethan came in to find a message from Shaw waiting on his desk. Keller confirmed. Good work. And under that, in Shaw's handwriting rather than typed, don't call any more maintenance companies without telling me first. Ethan set the note aside and pulled up the footage he'd been reviewing before he left the previous afternoon. He was 30 minutes into it when he found the thing he hadn't been looking for. The man from the maintenance log, the one connected to Voss, appeared on a service elevator camera from 5 weeks earlier. 3 seconds of footage, which was 3 seconds more than he should have. He was looking down, which meant he'd known about the elevator camera. But at the bottom of the frame, partially cut off, was a phone. And on the phone screen, visible for approximately 1.5 seconds, was a map. The map had a pin. Ethan enlarged it, cleaned up the resolution, sat back in his chair. The pin was not on Whitmore Capital. It was on a residential address 6 blocks south. The building where Vivian had moved Sophie after the garage attack, a location that only a handful of people knew about. He'd chosen specifically for that reason. His stomach dropped in a way it rarely did. He was on the phone to Shaw in under 10 seconds. Pull the captured team's interrogation records. Everything, not just the summaries. The actual transcripts. Why? Shaw asked. Because I think the garage was the opening move. Pause. You think there's a second operation? The maintenance man knew where Sophie was relocated. That means whoever planned this didn't stop planning after the garage. Ethan, read the transcripts tonight, Ethan said. Look for anything about contingency. Backup. Phase 2. Any language like that. He hung up and sat with the enlarged image on his monitor, the pin on the map, the address he recognized, the clear and specific implications that someone had done reconnaissance on a safe house that was supposed to be secret. Outside, the city was fully into its November rhythm, gray and cold and moving fast. Building 6 blocks south, Sophie Marlowe was presumably doing homework, or watching television, or being 8 years old in whatever way 8-year-olds managed to be normal after abnormal things, which children were often better at than adults gave them credit for. Ethan stared at the map pin. He thought about Lily, who checked under her bed for things she was afraid of, and then came and got him if she found anything, because that was the arrangement they'd made. She did the looking, he did the dealing with it. A fair division of labor. He picked up the phone again. Shaw this time. It's me, said when the sitter picked up. Is Lily home? Just walked in, the sitter said. She's fine. Wants to tell you about something that happened at lunch. Tell her I'll call her in 10 minutes. He hung up, looked at the screen again, made a decision. He walked down the hall to Vivian's office. Once opened without waiting, because knocking and waiting was for people who had more time than the situation allowed. Vivian looked up from her desk. Something in his face made her straighten. Sit down, he said. What happened? Sit down, Vivian. She sat. He laid out what he'd found in the same way he'd laid out the Keller evidence, clearly, sequentially, without embellishment and without softening. The maintenance man's phone, the map, the pin on Sophie's relocation address, timeline that suggested the garage attack was always intended as one step in a larger operation. When he finished, Vivian was very still. She's in danger, she said. Not a question. Possibly. We don't know yet whether the second operation is still active. If Voss pulled back when the first one failed, is that what you think happened? That he pulled back? Ethan met her eyes. Vivian's hands pressed flat on the desk, the same way they had the night before. What do we do? Shaw is reviewing the interrogation records tonight. There's evidence of a second operation. We move Sophie again. New location. Smaller circle of people who know it. Me, Shaw. Nobody else. Not even my assistant. Body else. She looked at him for a moment. I trust Derek. I know you do, Ethan said. And maybe that trust is right. We're not betting Sophie's safety on it right now. Vivian was quiet. He watched her process it, the cost of it. The admission that trust was a thing she had to ration differently than she had before. That the open-handed way she'd operated might have served her in business, but had become a liability in this. Okay, she said finally. It was the same word he used when he meant I understand, and I'll act on it, and he recognized it. I need to make a call, he said, standing. Lily's waiting. Vivian glanced up at that, briefly. Something in her expression that he couldn't quite read. She said, make your call. He went back to his small office and sat on the edge of the desk and called Lily, who informed him at length and with great feeling about the injustice of the school lunch situation, specifically the part where Marcus from her class had taken the last chocolate milk and she had been forced to have white milk instead, which was not the same thing at all. That does sound rough, Ethan agreed. It was, Lily confirmed. Are you coming home for dinner? A little late tonight, Bug. Mrs. Peterson's going to stay. How late? Late-ish. I'll be there when you wake up. Promise? Promise. Lily seemed to accept this. Then, is your shoulder better? Getting there. Mrs. Peterson says you should ice it. Mrs. Peterson is a smart woman. I know, Lily said, with the confidence of a 6-year-old who has always known which adults in her life are worth listening to. I'll save you some dinner. What are you having? Pasta. Save me a lot. She laughed a small, clean sound that moved through the phone and landed in the middle of his chest somewhere. Okay, Daddy. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment after she hung up. Down the hall, Vivian was probably already on with Shaw. The evening was already organizing itself around the problem, the way evenings had a way of doing when the problem was large enough. There would be long hours tonight and tomorrow, and however many days it took before they knew whether what he'd found in that footage was an active threat or a closed one. He stood up. His shoulder caught when he moved wrong and sent a sharp reminder along the whole left side. He put his jacket back on, pulled up the security feeds on his monitor, and went back to work. Shaw called at 9:40 that evening. Ethan was still in the office, which smelled by that hour of stale coffee, and the particular staleness of a room with no ventilation and too many monitors running. He had his jacket off, his sling slightly readjusted, because the standard position made the shoulder ache in a way that affected his concentration, and he was on his third pass through the footage from the service entrance, going back 6 weeks. I read the transcripts, Shaw said. Ethan waited. 2 of the captured men used contingency language during interrogation. They were careful about it, didn't give operational details. One of them, when pressed about whether the operation was finished, said the directive doesn't change when the first attempt fails. He said it once, and then went quiet. Shaw paused. That's not the language of someone who thinks it's over. Ethan said it's not. We need to move Sophie tomorrow morning. Ethan said. Another pause. Tonight is aggressive. Tonight is correct, Ethan said. If they have eyes on that building, and they know the first operation has been compromised, they know law enforcement is reviewing everything. That means their window to move on the second operation is narrowing. They're going to feel pressure. Shaw was quiet for 5 seconds. I'll make the call, small team. You, me, 2 of your people. Buddy from Vivian's corporate security. The leak in her security department hasn't been fully identified yet. Agreed. Shaw paused again. Ethan, get some sleep at some point. Probably, Ethan said, in the way of a person who is not planning to. He called Vivian next. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she'd been waiting. Tonight, he said. I'll be there in an hour, she said. You don't need to come. She's my daughter. You coming creates another vehicle, another visible movement, another. Ethan. Her voice was controlled, but the edges of it were not. She's my daughter. I'm coming. He let it go. Be in the garage in 45 minutes. Personal car, not the company fleet. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Understood. He hung up and spent a moment looking at the monitor, at the building 6 blocks south, at the ordinary nighttime street below it, cars passing, a couple walking a dog, the neighborhood going about its business entirely unaware. Then he got up, put his jacket back on, and walked toward the elevator. The shoulder was worse than it had been that morning. Bad enough to stop him. He'd made that calculus before. Worse circumstances. He'd make it tonight, the same way he always did. What needs doing matters more than what hurts. Pressed the lobby button. The elevator descended. Outside, the city glittered cold and indifferent. Somewhere in it, a 6-year-old girl was sleeping with the lights on because someone had once told her the dark was safer than the things that moved in it. And somewhere else, an 8-year-old was looking out a window at the same city and not entirely knowing why she felt like something was still coming. Ethan walked out into the November night, phone to his ear, calling Shaw. I'm on my way, he said. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cold, angled toward the parking structure, and didn't look back. They moved Sophie at 11:17 that night. No announcement, no convoy, no visible security presence that might signal to watching eyes that something was happening. Just 3 vehicles leaving the building's underground exit at 4-minute intervals, the first carrying 2 of Shaw's people as a forward sweep, the second carrying Sophie, her Aunt Carol, and the nanny in an unmarked sedan with tinted glass, and the third carrying Ethan in the back seat, watching the street behind them while Shaw drove and talked quietly into his radio. Vivian rode in the second vehicle with Sophie. She had been at the building when they arrived. Standing in the lobby in a coat she'd clearly thrown on over her work clothes, her hair not quite right, which was the first time Ethan had ever seen her look like she'd dressed in a hurry. She hadn't said anything when he'd walked in. She'd looked at him for a moment, then looked at Shaw, and then said, "Tell me what you need me to do," which was, in Ethan's assessment, a significant improvement over the woman who had fired him for changing. Sophie had been awake. 8-year-olds who've been through what Sophie had been through in the past week develop a particular alertness, a hair trigger for changes in the environment. Voices dropping, adults moving with purpose at unusual hours. She was sitting up in bed when her mother came in, already knowing something was happening. "Are we leaving?" she'd asked. "Yes, baby." "Because of the men?" Vivian had paused a half-second. "We're just being careful." "Is Ethan here?" That had been the question that stopped Vivian for a full breath. She'd turned in the doorway and looked at Ethan, who was standing in the hall. He stepped into the doorway so Sophie could see him. "Hi, Sophie. You?" She had looked at him with those enormous eyes, her mother's eyes, same color, same quality of evaluation, and then she'd nodded once, as if confirming something. She'd said, and gotten out of bed to pack her overnight bag without being asked, which was the most cooperative thing she'd done all week, according to the nanny. He thought about that now, watching the street behind them, the city sliding past in its nighttime state, the weight of what a frightened child's trust actually meant, and how much of a responsibility that was, and how he did not intend to be wrong about this the way the other people in Sophie's world had been wrong. The new location was a residential apartment in a quieter neighborhood owned by a shell holding company that had no visible connection to Whitmore Capital, arranged through a contact of Shaw's, who specialized in exactly this kind of thing. Third floor. 2 exits. Camera coverage on both stairwells and the main entrance. Ethan had reviewed the building layout 3 hours before the move. He'd walked the floor twice. When Sophie was inside and Carol and the nanny were settled, Vivian found him in the hallway outside the apartment, standing in that particular way he stood when he was not relaxing, but was also not doing anything visible. She went back to sleep in 15 minutes, Vivian said. She asked if you'd checked the hallway. I checked the hallway, he said. I told her. A moment passed. Down the hall, Shaw was on the phone, voice low, pacing. The building's heating system knocked somewhere in the walls, the particular sound of old infrastructure. You should go home, Ethan said. Get a few hours. So should you. I'm going to stay until 6. Shaw's leaving someone in the lobby overnight. Vivian looked at him for a moment. Ethan, you've been awake since before I was. I'm aware. Your shoulder, if you mention my shoulder one more time, I'm going to consider it harassment. She almost smiled, almost. That seems like a hostile work environment. Probably, he said. Go home, Vivian, she went. Happily. And not before checking on Sophie one more time, and not before stopping at the door and saying quietly, thank you. I seem to keep saying that. You can stop, he said. We're past the point where thank you covers it. She looked at him for a second, not offended by it, more like she was trying to figure out what did cover it. Then she left. Ethan pulled a chair from the apartment's small kitchen, set it in the hallway outside the apartment door, and sat with his back straight and his right hand resting on his knee and his eyes on the stairwell door at the end of the hall. The shoulder ached. He found the position that minimized it and held it. He sat there until 6 in the morning, when Shaw's officer arrived to relieve him, and Ethan drove home through the pale gray of early November dawn to make breakfast for a 6-year-old who greeted him at the kitchen door in her pajamas with a look that said she'd heard him come in and had been listening for it. You were here, Lily said. I said I would be. You smell like coffee and outside. Accurate. He crouched down. Carefully, the shoulder made crouching a production, and she hugged him around the neck with the complete physical commitment of a child who has not yet learned to hold herself back. He stood up with her, slowly, his right arm doing most of the work, and held her in the kitchen while the morning came through the window. Pancakes? She asked, muffled against his collar. Pancakes? He confirmed. Graham Keller was formally arrested on a Monday morning, 14 days after the garage attack. Whitmore Capital, parking structure, not the main garage, but the executive level on the 4th floor, which struck Ethan as a particular kind of irony that nobody except him seemed to notice. He had watched it on the security feed from his small 3rd-floor office. Shaw had offered to have him there in person, but Ethan had declined. He wasn't interested in the arrest as a spectacle, was interested in what happened after it, which names Keller gave up, which threads that pulled loose, how far back the rot went, and how many people were attached to it. Keller, it turned out, had not acted entirely alone. A man in Whitmore's corporate security department, a systems administrator named Pierce, who had access to physical entry credentials and alarm overrides, had been the second operational contact. It was Pierce who had updated the garage entry codes 3 days before the kidnapping attempt, creating a window during which the service entrance would respond to an older credential that the attackers had been provided. It was Pierce who had confirmed that Ethan's termination had been processed in the system before signaling the team to proceed. When the federal agents brought Pierce in, he lasted approximately 40 minutes in interrogation before he started talking. No, he was not built for the particular pressure of sitting in a room with people who already knew most of what you'd done and were primarily interested in confirming the rest. Keller was more composed. He had a lawyer present before the handcuffs were fully on, which meant the conversation was slower and more complicated. Communications evidence Shaw had obtained was extensive enough that composure only delayed things rather than preventing them. Ethan read the interrogation summaries in his office, with his coffee going cold beside him. The financial trail went back 7 months. Voss had approached Keller through an intermediary, identified him as a man with grievances. Vivian had passed him over for a board seat the previous year, a decision that Keller had publicly accepted and privately never forgiven, and offered him a combination of money and a promise. When Voss's acquisition attempt against Whitmore Capital succeeded, Keller would be installed in a senior position in the restructured company. He had traded Sophie's safety for a board seat he'd been denied. Ethan sat with that for a while, not in anger exactly. He'd been in enough situations to have a fairly clear-eyed view of what people were capable of when resentment and self-interest worked on them long enough. It didn't make it less ugly. It just made it comprehensible, which was its own particular kind of depressing. He was still sitting with it when Vivian appeared in his doorway. She looked like she hadn't slept much, which was accurate because he knew she hadn't. He'd text with her at 2 in the morning when neither of them could, and she'd responded with a brevity that suggested she was sitting somewhere in the dark, doing the same thing he was doing, which was trying to figure out how to hold what she now knew about the people around her. They briefed me, she said. Keller, the whole thing. Shaw told me. She came in and sat down across from him, which was the first time she'd sat in the chair across from his desk rather than standing in the doorway. Something about that small shift felt significant, though he couldn't have articulated exactly why. I promoted Graham, she said. Twice. I sat across a table from him twice a week for 9 years, she stopped. I thought I knew people. I built this company on the belief that I could assess people quickly and accurately. You're accurate more often than most, Ethan said. That's not the same as being accurate when it matters. He agreed. It isn't. She looked at him directly. You had him flagged by day 4. How? Ethan thought about how to answer that. Could have given her the technical version, the access log anomalies, the server room pattern, the cross-referencing, dates. All of that was true. But it wasn't the whole answer. He was too careful, Ethan said. Not in the way that was visible. Way that's invisible. The way a person moves when they're making sure they're not being seen. There's a specific quality to that. When you've spent enough time in environments where people are hiding things, you start to feel it before you can name it. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I spent my whole career thinking I saw people clearly. You see certain things clearly, Ethan said. Capability. Ambition, performance under pressure, those you read well. You read me wrong because I wasn't showing you any of those things. I was driving a car. She sat with that. That's a generous way to frame my mistake. Generous. Just accurate. You're a consistent man, Rourke. I try to be, he said. Makes life simpler. She almost smiled again. It was becoming a pattern. She'd get close and then pull back, like the smile was something she didn't trust herself to finish yet. Sophie asked about you again this morning. She wants to know if you've been back to the garage. For what purpose? I think she thinks of it as your territory. Like you're the one who makes it safe. Vivian paused. She's not wrong, technically. Ethan didn't say anything to that. She's doing better, Vivian continued. The therapist says the fact that she's talking about it, engaging with it, asking questions that's healthy. She'll carry it, but she won't be buried by it. She stopped again. I hope. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, Ethan said. And she's got her mother's spine. That counts for something. Vivian looked at him. That evaluation quality in her eyes that he'd noticed from the beginning, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. You're better at this than you should be. At what? What to say or not say. She stood. I'm going to the federal briefing at 2. Shaw wants you there. I'll be there. She moved toward the door and then stopped, half turning. Ethan, the work you've done in these 2 weeks, what you found, how you found it. She paused, and he could see her deciding how to say the next part. I'm not going to pretend I understood what I had when I had it. That would be a lie. And you've figured out I don't do well with things that aren't straight. I've noticed, he said. I'm saying I see it now. What you are. What I almost... She stopped, didn't finish it. I see it now. He nodded once. Okay. She left. He listened to her footsteps down the hall, the elevator, the silence that followed. Outside his window, he still had no window, but he'd propped the door open and could see the hallway, which was close enough the building moved through its afternoon. Ordinary sounds, a company continuing. He picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. The federal briefing was in a downtown building that had the particular soulless quality of all federal buildings, gray carpet, fluorescent lighting, conference rooms named after letters and numbers, instead of anything human. Ethan sat at the end of the table, slightly removed from the main cluster of investigators and legal people, which was where he was most comfortable. Shaw sat beside him and spent the first 20 minutes watching Ethan watch the room before finally leaning over and saying quietly, "You do know you're not working surveillance right now." "Force of habit," Ethan said. "You assessed every person who walked in. Old reflex, including the woman from the DOJ, who's 63 years old and brought a tote bag with a cat on it. She walked in checking the sightlines," Ethan said. "Old reflex on her part too, probably." Shaw looked at the woman in question, who was now reviewing documents with complete ordinariness. He looked back at Ethan. "You're exhausting," he said, with what appeared to be genuine admiration. The briefing itself covered what Ethan largely already knew: the evidence against Keller and Pierce, the financial trail to Voss, the operational structure of the kidnapping team, the legal framework moving forward. What it added was the bigger picture of Damien Voss' self, a businessman with a particular history of aggressive acquisition tactics, several of which had involved information extraction operations of varying legality. "He's done this before," one of the federal agents said, clicking through a slide. "Kidnapping specifically. But obtaining competitive intelligence through compromising insiders, creating pressure on target companies through coordinated information releases. He's careful about staying in the gray areas." "The kidnapping wasn't a gray area," Vivian said from across the table. "And that represents an escalation in his methods that we're treating seriously." The agent clicked to the next slide. "Which is why we're not treating this as closed, simply because Keller and Pierce are in custody. Voss himself is the target." "What's the timeline?" Shaw asked. "Weeks, not months. The financial evidence is strong. We're building the chain of instruction from Voss to Keller to the operational team. Takes time to do it in a way that doesn't leave gaps a defense attorney can walk through." Ethan had been quiet through most of this. He spoke once, toward the end, when the discussion turned to Sophie's ongoing security. "The relocation we did last week should hold," he said. "The circle of people with the address is small enough. But I want a review of the building's service contractor list. Anyone with building access in the last 30 days needs to be verified." "That's a substantial undertaking," the agent said. "Yes," Ethan said. "Do it anyway." There was a brief pause in the room. The federal agent looked at Ethan with an expression that was caught somewhere between mildly offended and reluctantly persuaded. Shaw looked at the ceiling. Vivian, across the table, looked at her hands and said nothing. "We'll add it to the workload," the agent said finally. After the briefing, standing in the gray hallway while people dispersed around them, Shaw pulled Ethan aside. "You could try being slightly less direct with the federal agents." "I could," Ethan said, "but you won't." "Probably not." Shaw shook his head. "How long do you think before Voss makes another move?" "If he makes one." Ethan had been thinking about that since the night he'd found the map pin on the surveillance footage. Thinking about it the way he'd been trained to think about it, not from his own position but from the other side. Thinking what he would do if he were Voss and his first operation had failed, and his inside contacts were now in federal custody, and the window of opportunity was closing as investigators built their case. "He's calculating right now," Ethan said, "weighing whether cutting losses is smarter than trying to finish what he started. The problem is that the kidnapping attempt creates a legal exposure he can't undo. Those men in custody can talk. And eventually one of them will talk enough. Which means his best outcome is to disappear into legal maneuvering and hope the chain of instruction doesn't hold together. And his worst outcome, he tries to create leverage. Something that makes cooperation less attractive to the people who could testify against him." Ethan stopped. "Sophie," Shaw looked at him. "You think he'd still go after her? With this much heat?" "Think a man who's watching a federal case build against him gets desperate in ways that override rational calculation. And I think the second operative plan was already built, already resourced. Sometimes the machine keeps moving even after the reason for it changes." Shaw was quiet for a moment. "I'll push the surveillance on Voss's known associates." "Tonight," Ethan said. "You always want everything done tonight." "Tonight is when people think nobody's watching," Ethan said. "The most useful time." Shaw left to make calls. Ethan stood in the federal building hallway and checked his phone. Text from the sitter. Lily made you a drawing at school today. Something with a dog, maybe a cat? She says it's you. He wrote back, tell her I'll put it on the fridge. He pocketed the phone, nodded to Vivian as she came out of the conference room, pulling her coat on, and they walked toward the elevator together. How long? She asked. Before what? Before this is actually over. He pressed the elevator button. Weeks, maybe more. Voss is in custody. There's a thread that doesn't have an end. She absorbed that. The elevator opened and they got in. I've been thinking about something you said, Vivian said, as the doors closed. About Graham. That he was too careful in a way that was invisible. And I've been trying to think if there was a moment when I felt that and didn't name it. She was looking at the elevator doors rather than at him. There probably was. A moment where something felt slightly off and I attributed it to something else. That's usually how it goes, he said. We explain away the things that don't fit the picture we've already decided on. Is that what I did with you? Decided on a picture and stopped looking? The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Ethan stepped out, turned slightly. You saw a driver, he said. I was a driver. You didn't have a reason to look past it. You had a daughter, she said. You'd served 8 years in a branch of the military. Most people couldn't survive. You'd lost your wife. She paused. I worked beside you for 3 years, and I didn't know any of it. I didn't tell you, he said. I didn't need to. That's not the point. What is the point? She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way she had a habit of doing when she'd stopped performing certainty and was just thinking. Point is that everyone around me is a whole person, and I've been running my world like they're pieces on a board. She stopped. Sophie's kidnapper knew more about you than I did. That should not be true. Ethan didn't have an answer for that, because she was right and saying so felt unnecessary. They walked out into the November afternoon, the city, cold and moving, both of them thinking. His phone rang. Shaw. He picked up immediately. Ethan. Shaw's voice had shifted into the register he used when things had moved faster than expected. The surveillance team just flagged an SUV circling Sophie's building. No plates visible from the angle they have. Third pass in 90 minutes. Everything in Ethan sharpened. Man, with a fake maintenance credential, tried the service entrance 20 minutes ago, Shaw continued. Building super turned him away, but he didn't leave the area. Beside him, Vivian had gone very still. She could hear enough from Shaw's voice to know. Where are you? Shaw asked. 8 minutes away, Ethan said. He was already moving. Who's in the building? My officer in the lobby. 2 more outside. But Ethan, this guy knows building layouts. If he finds a secondary access, get Sophie into the interior room away from windows, Ethan said. Bathroom, closet, something without exterior walls. Keep her there. He looked at Vivian. Her face was white and controlled. Stay with Shaw, he told her. Sophie is in a room with federal officers and I'm 8 minutes out. Stay with Shaw. He held her eyes for a second, long enough to make it a real instruction rather than a dismissal. You're not going to help her by being in the building. You're going to give them another person to use. Vivian closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them. Go, she said. He went. He ran 2 red lights and wasn't particularly sorry about it. The city traffic parted the way. City traffic does when someone is moving through it with enough urgency, and the November afternoon was gray enough that his headlights cut through the murk, and he covered 7 of the 8 minutes in 5, which left him 1 block out when Shaw called again. He's inside, Shaw said. Service door on the north side. Someone propped it an hour ago, wasn't caught until the second sweep. He's in the stairwell. What floor? We don't know yet. He killed the stairwell camera at the second floor landing. Ethan was already parking, half on the curb, because there was no time for anything elegant. Sophie. Interior bathroom. Carol and the nanny with her. My officer outside the door. 1 officer. 2 more coming up from the lobby elevators slow. They're taking stairs. Which stairwell? South. The intruder was in the north stairwell. Moving up. Ethan ran the calculation north stairs. 14th floor. The 2 officers coming up the south stairs. Himself entering from the lobby, and the calculation produced a number he didn't like. He went through the lobby at a pace that made the building's actual super flatten himself against the wall, badged through the internal door with the credential Shaw had set up for him 3 days ago. took north, as that was where the problem was, and the problem needed to be met rather than waited for. The north's stairs smelled like dust and the particular cold of concrete shafts that never get direct heat. He moved up fast and quiet, his right hand on the railing, his left arm against his body, the shoulder already registering protest that he was filing away to deal with later. 7th floor, 8th. The building around him was entirely ordinary faint sounds of televisions, someone cooking, life being lived behind closed doors at 5:30 on a weekday evening. He slowed at the 10th floor landing, listened. Above him, 2 floors up, there was a sound that wasn't the building. It was the careful, deliberate sound of someone moving in a way designed not to be heard, which paradoxically made it audible to anyone who knew what to listen for. Ethan took the next 2 floors the way he'd moved in the parking garage economy of motion. Nothing wasted. His attention split evenly between the steps under his feet and the space above him. The 12th floor landing, he stopped completely. The stairwell door to the 12th floor was slightly ajar. Open, not closed. The particular position of a door held by a hand that hadn't decided yet. He waited. 3 seconds. The door swung open and the man came through fast, and Ethan was already moving when he did. He was large, in his 40s, carrying something in his right hand, a radio, a weapon, which told Ethan he was trying to confirm Sophie's location before moving up. Meant there was a second man. There was always a second man in operations that were organized enough to have contingency plans. Building security, Ethan said, which was close enough to true that he could say it without flinching. On the ground, the man looked at him, assessed the sling, the one functional arm, and made the same mistake the man in the garage had made. He decided Ethan wasn't a real problem. That decision lasted about 4 seconds. What followed was ugly and painful, and conducted mostly in near silence, because neither man was interested in announcing himself. Ethan took the radio out of the equation first, which mattered, because the second operative couldn't be called if the first couldn't transmit. The man was stronger than anyone Ethan had fought recently. Maybe the shoulder made it feel that way, a white, breathtaking burst of pain when the man caught his left arm and wrenched. Ethan made a sound he hadn't made in a long time. A sound that came from somewhere past training and into just the body's raw response to damage. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because 14 floors up, Sophie Marlowe was in a bathroom with her aunt and her nanny and a single officer. The second man was still somewhere in the building, and stopping was not an available option. 30 seconds. 40. The stairwell wall was cold against his back at one point, and then it wasn't, and the man was down, and Ethan was breathing hard with his back against the railing, and his left arm doing nothing useful at all. From below, he heard the south stairwell door bang open Shaw's officers, finally at this floor. From above, he heard, no, running. The second operative, who had been waiting on the 14th floor, had heard enough to know the plan had come apart. Ethan straightened, started up the stairs. Shaw's voice came through on his earpiece. Ethan, we have the second man. He came out the 14th floor exit. 2 officers intercepted. Stand down. He stopped on the 13th floor landing, his hand on the railing, his breath coming hard. Sophie, he said. Safe, Shaw said. Bathroom exactly where we put her. Body got past the officer. He sat down on the stairs. Just for a moment. His left arm was wrong, in a way that was different from the previous wrong. Something new had happened in there, during the last 40 seconds. Something that was going to require a conversation with a surgeon that he was already dreading. From 14 floors up, he could hear faintly the sound of officers moving, of a door opening, of a child's voice not screaming, not crying, asking a question in the particular tone of a child who needs information and has decided that getting it is more useful than falling apart. Sophie's voice, asking if it was over. He sat on the stair and listened to one of the officers tell her, yes, it was over. She was safe. His shoulder was on fire. His breathing was starting to slow. 14 floors above him and 6 blocks across the city, a spot he couldn't see. Vivian Marlowe was probably standing on a sidewalk with Shaw's number dialed, waiting for the call that told her one way or the other. Picked up his phone, called her directly. She picked up before the first ring finished. She's safe, Ethan said. Both men are down. Sophie is in the apartment. She's okay. The silence on the other end of the line had a quality to it that was different from the silences he'd come to recognize in Vivian. It was not controlled. It was not professional. It was the sound of a person's entire body exhaling a breath it had been holding for 10 days. Okay, she said. Her voice was different. Okay. You can come now, he said. Shaw will send someone to get you. Are you? She stopped. Your shoulder. I'll deal with it, he said. I'll deal with it, he said again. Vivian, go see your daughter. A pause. Thank you, she said. Quieter, I keep saying that, and it keeps being inadequate. He looked at the gray concrete of the stairwell wall, bare fluorescent tube humming above the landing. At his own hand on the railing, the knuckles scraped. Nothing interesting. Go see Sophie, he said. He hung up. Sat on the step for another minute, maybe two, listening to the building settle into the strange calm that comes after something violent passes through it. Then he pushed himself up, using the railing, and started the slow climb up the last 2 floors. He needed to see the hallway for himself. He needed to confirm, with his own eyes and not a phone call, the door to apartment 1407 was intact, and the officer outside it was standing. And the sounds from inside were the sounds of frightened people discovering they were no longer in danger. The shoulder told him at length and with feeling everything it thought about the stairs. He climbed them anyway. The hallway of the 14th floor looked exactly the way hallways look after something terrible almost happens in them ordinary. Cream-colored walls, industrial carpet, numbers on doors, kind of place where nothing remarkable ever occurs, except that tonight it had, and the remaining evidence was 2 officers standing outside apartment 1407, and the particular careful stillness of a space that hasn't quite exhaled yet. Ethan came off the stairwell door and into the hallway, and the nearest officer, a young woman named Reyes, who Shaw had assigned to Sophie's detail 3 days ago, looked at him and then looked at his left arm and said, "Sir, you need medical attention." A minute, he said, "Status. Both subjects secured." Second operative was taken at the exit. He tried to go through the fire door to the exterior staircase when he heard the radio go down. Officers Milligan and Tran intercepted. She paused. The apartment is secure. Everyone inside is okay. Shaken, not hurt. Reyes hesitated. She asked for you. He moved to the apartment door. Twice, which was the signal they'd established 2 knocks. Pause, so that Carol would know it wasn't another threat. The door opened on the chain. First Carol's face in the gap. Then the chain came off and the door opened fully. The apartment looked cut like a place that had been held together by will for the last 40 minutes. Carol's hair was coming loose, her hands still not quite steady. The nanny, Maria, was sitting on the couch with her knees pressed together and her hands in her lap in the posture of someone who has been telling themselves to hold it together and has largely succeeded. From the hallway that led to the bathroom, the officer who'd been stationed inside the apartment, a solid, calm man named Garrett, gave Ethan a nod that said everything was where it was supposed to be. Sophie came out of the bathroom. She was in her pajamas, the same ones from the night they'd moved her, because nobody had thought to get different ones, and she hadn't asked. Her hair was messy, and her feet were bare on the apartment floor, and she looked at Ethan with those eyes that had too much knowledge in them for an 8-year-old. She crossed the room and hugged him around the middle, carefully on the right side, which told him that at some point in the evening she'd registered which arm was wrong and had filed it away. He put his right hand on the back of her head. Didn't say anything for a moment. "I heard the sound," she said against his jacket. "In the stairwell. I heard something." "I know." The officer said it was the building. The officer was trying to keep you calm. Sophie pulled back and looked up at him. "Was it you?" "It was handled," he said. "You did what you were supposed to do. You stayed put. I wanted to open the door." "I know. Staying was harder. You did the harder thing." She seemed to accept that, in the way she accepted things fully, without pretending it hadn't been difficult. She went back to the couch and sat beside Maria and pulled the throw blanket over her lap with a kind of deliberate composure that reminded him uncomfortably of her mother. Carol touched his right arm, gently. "Your shoulder," she said. "It's on the list," he said. He pulled out his phone and texted Shaw. "Both floors clear. Sophie secure. I need a medical unit when you get up here." Shaw's response came in under 30 seconds, already called. And Vivian is 4 minutes out. Try to look less destroyed when she arrives. Pocketed the phone. Sat down in the armchair nearest the door. Not because he needed to sit. He told himself because standing was becoming a statement of stubbornness rather than necessity, and he was trying to be practical about it. The shoulder had moved past the hot, specific pain of acute injury into something deeper and more constant, the kind of ache that meant the structure underneath was genuinely unhappy. He'd had this conversation with his body before. He knew what the surgeon was going to say, and he was already composing his response to it, which was going to involve the word manageable, and the surgeon's response to that was going to involve several other words that Ethan would not particularly enjoy. He sat. He watched Sophie on the couch. He waited. Vivian came through the apartment door 4 minutes and 20 seconds after Shaw's text, which meant she'd been moving fast from the moment she'd been cleared to come. She was still in her work clothes, her coat half off her shoulders, and she crossed the room to Sophie with the focused singularity of a woman who had spent the last 40 minutes in a controlled demolition of her own composure and was now done with the controlled part. Sophie stood up from the couch. There was no dramatic speech. Vivian pulled her daughter in and held her the way parents hold children when the alternative to holding them was something they refused to let themselves think about. Sophie's arms went around her mother's neck, and they stayed like that in the middle of the rented apartment, while Carol quietly took Maria to the kitchen, and Officer Garrett found something to study on the other side of the room. Ethan watched the door. After a while, Vivian looked up. She found him in the armchair, which was where he'd been the whole time. Eyes moved immediately to his left arm in the way they always did, and he was beginning to accept that this was simply going to be a feature of his life for the foreseeable future. She said something to Sophie quiet close, and Sophie nodded and went to sit with Carol, who had reappeared with a cup of tea that Sophie accepted with the automatic politeness of a child raised to say thank you even when her whole life had recently been frightening. Vivian crossed the room to Ethan. She didn't sit. She stood in front of him and looked at his arm and then at his face, in that order, and the look on her face was not the professional assessment she usually deployed. It was something less composed than that, something she was not trying to manage. The surgeon is going to say surgery, she said. Probably, he said. Soon. How soon? Soon enough. He shifted in the chair, which was a mistake, and she saw him do it, and he saw her register it with the tightening around her eyes that she did when she was controlling a reaction. I'm fine, Vivian. You are not fine. I'm functional, which is close enough for tonight. She sat down on the edge of the coffee table across from him, which put her closer than she usually stationed herself in professional contexts. Close enough that he could see the evening's toll on her face, the tiredness under her eyes, the places where the composure had worn thin. She looked, for the first time in his experience of her, like someone who had been genuinely scared and hadn't fully come down from it yet. Both men are in custody, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been briefed on the way over. Yes. Shaw says the second one is already talking. Fear does that, Ethan said. He came in expecting it to go a specific way, and it went another way, and now he's in a room recalculating what cooperation is worth to him. Vivian looked at him for a moment. How many times have you done this? This kind of thing. Which part? Any of it. She made a small gesture that encompassed the apartment. Evening, his arm, the general category of events that had constituted the past 2 weeks. Walked into situations that most people would walk away from. He thought about how to answer that. Not the number, because the number was complicated. Most of it happened in places that didn't make it into any report anyone would ever read. Times that it stopped feeling like a decision, he said. It just became what happens when there's something that needs doing, and I'm the person standing there. That's not an answer. It's the truest one I have. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the apartment window, the city was in its nighttime phase, the particular quiet that isn't actually quiet, just a different arrangement of sounds. Sirens somewhere, distant. Traffic. The building's heating system doing its old building knock. When Lily's school called last year, Ethan said, but sure entirely why he was saying it. Because she'd gotten into a fight she doesn't fight. She's 6, but apparently Marcus from the chocolate milk situation pushed her, and she pushed back, and they both got sent to the principal. The principal asked me how I wanted to handle it. He stopped. And I sat there thinking that I'd handled situations where the consequences of getting it wrong were considerably more significant than a 6-year-old's recess privileges, and I had no idea what to say. I asked her if she was okay first. Then I asked what she'd been thinking. She said Marcus had been mean to someone smaller than him, and she didn't like it. He paused. I didn't know how to tell her she was right and wrong at the same time, so I told her we don't solve things with pushing. She said, I do, and I didn't have a good answer for that. Vivian looked at him. Something in her expression had shifted while he was talking, moved away from the professional distance, and towards something more direct. What did you tell her? I told her it's different when it's your job, and she told me she wanted it to be her job too, and I told her she should think about being a doctor instead. And she told me doctors have to see blood. Yes, he'd intervened, and we went back and forth for about 20 minutes, and then she had a snack and forgot about it. Vivian's mouth moved into something that was fully a smile this time, but complete. She sounds like a handful. She's the best person I know, Ethan said. She's also absolutely a handful. The smile held for a moment, and then Vivian looked at her hands and then back at him. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if you think the honest answer is going to be uncomfortable. Right? Did you believe, tonight, when you went into that stairwell, did you believe you were going to be okay? He looked at her steadily. I believed Sophie was going to be okay. Vivian held his gaze. That's not what I asked, he said. It isn't. She sat with that answer, which was not really an answer, but contained all the answer there was. He watched her absorb it, the specific weight of someone saying without saying it, that they went into something knowing the odds were arranged in a particular way and went anyway, because the alternative was worse. You can't keep doing that, she said. Not in order. Professional instruction. Something quieter than either of those things. I'm aware, he said. Ethan Shaw knocked twice, paused, knocked once. Ethan called out that the door was open, and Shaw came in with a paramedic and the efficient energy of a man who had been managing moving pieces for 4 hours and was beginning to see them slow down into something resolvable. Voss, Shaw said to Ethan directly, because Shaw understood that Ethan wanted the operational update before anything else. Federal team executed a warrant on his residence 40 minutes ago. He was there. He's in custody. The room processed that. Vivian straightened. Carol, in the kitchen doorway, pressed her hand over her mouth. He didn't run, Ethan said. Apparently he'd concluded that the second operation had succeeded. His communications team hadn't updated him on the stairwell situation yet. It was according to the arresting agents in a good mood when they arrived. Shaw's expression carried a quality of dry satisfaction. He was not in a good mood shortly afterward. The second operative who was talking, Ethan said. What's he giving them? Enough. The chain of instruction from Voss to the operational team is going to hold. His lawyers are already there, but the financial evidence doesn't have interpretive flexibility. It says what it says. Shaw looked at the paramedic. Speaking of things that need attention, he looked pointedly at Ethan's arm. The paramedic, a practical woman named Torres, who had clearly been briefed on the TSCs and had decided that her role tonight was to deal with the physical reality rather than the narrative of it, set her bag down beside the armchair. Mr. Rourke, may I go ahead? Ethan said. Assessment was not pleasant. Torres was efficient and thorough and did not editorialize, which he appreciated, but the mechanics of examining the shoulder required moving it in ways that produced responses he couldn't entirely keep off his face. Across the room, Sophie had come back from the kitchen with her tea and was watching with the frank curiosity of a child who has decided that watching a medical assessment is more interesting than pretending not to. Torres said, which was not a diagnosis but was accurate enough. You need imaging and almost certainly surgery. Tonight, if possible, Ethan said. Tonight is better. Tomorrow, he said again. I need to make sure the situation here is wrapped. Torres looked at Shaw. Shaw looked at the ceiling. The situation here, Shaw said, is wrapped. Voss is in custody. Both operatives from tonight are in custody. Sophie is safe in a building with 4 officers, and the 3 of us. Is nothing remaining that requires you specifically to be in this specific room with a shoulder that is actively damaging itself. He's right, Vivian said from across the room. Ethan looked at Torres. Tomorrow morning. First thing. Torres, who was not paid to argue with people who had already made their decisions, made a note. I'll wrap it tonight. You don't move it. At all. You actually sleep, not sit in a chair watching a hallway, and you are in a surgical consultation at 8 a. Or I am calling Detective Shaw and telling him, you require involuntary medical supervision. That's not a real thing, Ethan said. I'll make it a real thing, Torres said pleasantly and began rapping. Sophie fell asleep at 11:30 on the apartment couch, still in her pajamas with the throw blanket and Carol sitting beside her reading something on her phone. Maria had gone to bed in the second bedroom. Shaw's officers had rotated, fresh pair on the door. Buildings had settled into a quiet that felt different from earlier, not the held breath quiet of threat. Ordinary quiet of a late night in a residential building where nothing was currently wrong. Ethan was still in the armchair. His arm was properly wrapped and immobilized now, and Torres had been correct that the wrapping helped, and he was not going to say so out loud. Vivian sat on the other end of the couch from Carol, close enough to Sophie that she could reach out and touch her daughter's ankle under the blanket. She had taken her coat off at some point and her hair was down, which Ethan had never seen. Yet, she looked like a different person from the one who had fired him in a car 3 weeks ago. Or maybe not different, more complete. Like the version of her that existed when she wasn't performing certainty. They sat in the quiet for a while without talking, which was a thing that Ethan had noticed they had become capable of. In the early days of the investigation, every silence between them had the slight discomfort of two people who didn't know what they were to each other, and were both too focused to work it out. The silence was more like the quiet between people who don't need to fill space to justify occupying it. She's going to be okay, Ethan said, looking at Sophie. Vivian said, I think I know. I keep having to remind myself. She paused. Her therapist says this kind of thing, children who come through something frightening with a sense of the agency is protective. Sophie kept making decisions, staying put, asking for you, counting. Apparently she counted to herself in the bathroom. What did she count to? She said she counted to whatever number it took. Vivian smiled a little at that. That's an 8-year-old's version of keeping it together. It worked, Ethan said. It worked. Vivian looked at her daughter for a moment. What about Lily? When she finds out not the details, but that you were involved in something. Kids figure out more than you tell them. He had thought about that. Lily was perceptive in the way of children who have grown up with a parent who is often quiet and occasionally tense and has learned to read the difference between regular quiet and significant quiet. Something had happened. She already knew something had happened, probably because Mrs. Peterson was not a person who successfully concealed things from children. I'll tell her what she can hold, he said, that I helped someone who needed it, that it's done, and if she asks for more, I'll answer what she asks, as honestly as I can at her age. He shifted slightly in the chair. She's going to ask if I was scared. Were you? He considered that genuinely the way he considered things that deserved a real answer. In the stairwell tonight, not scared of the guy, scared of the math. There were 60 seconds in there where I wasn't sure the shoulder was going to hold long enough, and the math of what happened if it didn't was the part that was frightening. Vivian was looking at him. So yes, he said, I was scared. I just put it in a different room and dealt with the problem first. A different room, she repeated. It's a technique, he said. Perfect one. The room gets crowded eventually. And then what? And then you sit in a parking structure at 1 a.m. and don't sleep, he said, or you make pancakes with your kid and let that crowd it out. Something moved across her face. The morning of the garage. The day I fired you. You'd made pancakes with Lily for breakfast. Every Tuesday, he said. And then you went to work, and I fired you. And 40 minutes later, you were holding 5 men in a parking garage with a torn shoulder. That's the sequence, he said. She shook her head slightly, in disbelief, more in the particular way of someone recalibrating around a fact they are still absorbing. What would you have done, she said slowly, if you hadn't heard her? If you'd been 10 seconds faster to these exit? Thought about that too. At 2 a.m., at 3. The geometry of it. 10 seconds. 15. I don't spend a lot of time in that direction, he said. What happened is what happened. Sophie's on that couch. That's the version we got. I know, I still think about the other versions. That's because you're her mother, he said. That's the right thing to think about, if you're her mother. From where I'm standing, I heard her, and I moved. Everything after that is just the result of those two things. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. The apartment was very quiet. Carol had fallen asleep on her end of the couch, head tipped back, slightly open. The most human Carol had looked in the entire time Ethan had known her. I want to offer you something, Vivian said, and I want to do it right, so I'm going to say it carefully. Okay, I want to offer you a permanent position, security consulting, specifically for Whitmore Capital, and specifically built around what you're actually good at: threat assessment, internal security architecture, kind of systemic thinking that found Keller in 4 days when my entire security department missed him for 4 months. She paused. With a salary that's appropriate for what that actually is. What a driver makes. He looked at her. The schedule is yours, she continued. Lily's appointments, her school events, whatever she needs, that is the schedule. You told me she came first, and I told you that was the operating condition. And I meant it. I mean it more now than I did when I said it. Why now? He asked. Suspicious. Just wanting the honest version. Because tonight it occurred to me that I've been operating as though the right thing to do is to retain useful assets. She said the word with a deliberate flatness that made clear she knew how it sounded. And what I actually want to do is keep someone I trust in a world that has turned out to be considerably less trustworthy than I believed. She met his eyes. Those are different things. I want you to know, I know they're different things. He sat with that for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the building, something beeped, a smoke detector doing its low battery complaint, the most mundane sound in the world. It beeped twice and then stopped. I have one condition to add, he said. Name it. The security restructuring, I run it the right way, which means I'll find things you don't want found. There are probably more people in that company whose access and behavior don't add up. I'm not going to manage what I tell you to protect anyone's feelings or their employment status. I wouldn't want you to, Vivian said. And there's going to be a period where the company feels uncomfortable because I'm asking questions and pulling records, and people don't like being looked at. That discomfort is part of the process. Understood. I'll also be wrong sometimes, he said. I'll flag someone who turns out to be clean. I don't do that often, but I do it. I'd rather you know up front than find out later, and wonder if I told you. She looked at him steadily. I appreciate that more than you probably expect. He said, that's why I said it. A silence. Vivian held out her hand across the small space between the couch and the armchair. He reached over with his right hand, the working one, and shook it. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, which was a perfectly businesslike amount of time, and neither of them made it into more than it was, and both of them were aware that it was, in fact, more than it was. He's left at 1 in the morning, when Shaw confirmed the overnight rotation was solid, and Torres had rechecked the wrapping, and Vivian had finally, moderate collective pressure from 3 adults, agreed to sleep on the apartment's second couch rather than maintain vigil over Sophie indefinitely. The elevator down to the lobby was slow. The building's old mechanics grinding through it with the effort of something that has been doing the same job for 30 years and doesn't intend to do it quickly. Ethan stood in it with his back against the wall, and his eyes closed for approximately 90 seconds, which was the closest he'd come to rest since early that morning. The lobby officer, a young man named Bell who'd been on since 8 and had the slightly glazed quality of someone in hour 5 of what was supposed to be a quiet watch, straightened when he saw Ethan. Sir, you need a car? I'm fine to drive. Bell looked at the sling with the particular expression of a person who has something to say and is calculating whether it's their place to say it. He arrived at the conclusion that it probably wasn't and said nothing, which Ethan respected. He walked out into the November night. The city at 1A was its own particular version of itself, quieter than it pretended to be during the day, the true bones of it visible when the volume turned down. Stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the cold air, letting his eyes adjust to the street lighting. His phone buzzed. A text from the sitter. She woke up once at midnight. Asked for you. I told her you'd be home soon and she went back to sleep. She's good. He looked at the text for a moment. Then he wrote back, tell her I'm on my way. He intervened. He found his car, where he'd left it half on the curb, the parking citation tucked under the wiper, which was the most ordinary problem he'd encountered in 3 weeks, and he looked at it with something approaching affection. Took it off the wiper, folded it, put it in his pocket. He drove home through streets that were as close to quiet as the city ever got. The shoulder, a constant low voice he'd learned to talk over. The heater, running because November, at 1A, was unambiguously cold, and he had stopped feeling like he needed to tolerate cold, for no reason sometime around the 3rd year of doing it professionally. Lily's light was off when he came in. He could see the thin line of darkness under her door, the particular darkness of a room where a small person is genuinely asleep rather than just lying quietly. He stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment. He thought about a parking garage and a cold Tuesday morning and a decision that had cost him a job and led to everything that followed. About the mathematics of small moments, how the difference between 10 seconds and 45 seconds can be the difference between a child coming home and a child not coming home. About the things he'd said to Lily about bravery, not being the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it anyway, which was something he'd said to her in the context of the dark under her bed, and which turned out, like most things you tell children, to have a much larger application than you intended when you said it. He went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water, and looked at Lily's latest drawing on the refrigerator, whatever she'd made at school, which the sitter had put up. It was, as advertised, ambiguous. A figure with a circle head and stick arms, and something that might have been a dog or a cat standing beside it. Underneath, in the careful letters of a 6-year-old still making peace with the alphabet, Daddy and Friend. He didn't know where the friend had come from. Lily's imagination operated on its own schedule. He straightened the drawing slightly. A small thing. It's necessary. He turned off the kitchen light and went to check that the front door was locked, the windows latched. The ordinary inventory of a person who has spent enough time thinking about vulnerability to have made domestic security a reflex. Everything was as it should be. He sat on the edge of his bed and took off his shoes and thought about whether surgery at 8 in the morning was going to allow him to get Lily to school first, and concluded that it probably would if he moved things by 30 minutes and made a mental note to set the alarm accordingly. He lay back on the bed without fully getting into it, his right arm behind his head, his left arm carefully arranged alongside his body, and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere across the city, Sophie Marlowe was sleeping on a couch in a rented apartment, safe, with her mother 10 feet away. Damien Voss was in federal custody. Graham Keller was in federal custody. The men from the stairwell were in federal custody. Yes, he'd intervened the machine that had been pointed at an 8-year-old girl for reasons that had nothing to do with her, for leverage, for acquisition targets, for a bored seat and wounded pride. That machine had run into the wrong Tuesday morning, and now it was stopped. Ethan looked at the ceiling. His shoulder ached. His alarm was set for 6:15. In the next room, his daughter was breathing in the even, untroubled rhythm of a person who had checked under her bed. Nothing, and concluded that the hallway was adequately covered. Closed his eyes. The city went on outside his window, indifferent and alive, and full of people who didn't know what had happened tonight in a stairwell on the 14th floor of a residential building, didn't know, and didn't need to, because that was exactly the point. The world moving forward as though nothing had broken was the proof that nothing had, quite. He was asleep in 4 minutes, which was not something he managed often, and which the shoulder registered a complaint about, and then lost the argument because he was already somewhere past where complaints could reach him. In the morning there would be a 6-year-old wanting pancakes and an 8A surgical consultation, and a company whose internal security he was now formally responsible for rebuilding from the ground up. Yes, he'd intervened, and Vivian Marlowe on the other end of an arrangement that was new enough that neither of them had looked at it directly yet. All of that was tomorrow. Tonight, the hallway was covered and the doors were locked, and the city was quiet enough. It was enough. The surgery took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Ethan was awake for the first part of it, the preparation, the cold of the operating room, the particular institutional smell of a place designed entirely around function. And then the anesthesia did what anesthesia does, and the next thing he was aware of was a recovery room ceiling, and a nurse telling him his name in the careful, slightly elevated volume people use with patients coming out of sedation, as though consciousness is something you have to speak loudly enough to reach. He'd managed to get Lisley to school first. 6:15, alarm. Pancakes from a box, because the shoulder made the from-scratch version a two-handed operation, and he was down to one, Lily eating them with the uncritical enthusiasm of a child who had not yet developed opinions about batter consistency. He looked at the new elaborate sling the hospital had sent him home with the previous night and said, with the gravity of a 6-year-old rendering a verdict, "That one's bigger." It is, he'd confirmed. "Does it hurt more?" "About the same." She'd considered this while eating her pancake. "Mrs. Chem's husband had a sling," he said. It itched. "It does itch," Ethan said. "I'll get you a stick," she said helpfully, "for scratching." He had told her he appreciated that, and meant it, and driven her to school with his right hand on the wheel and his left arm immobilized, and the morning cold enough that the car heater was running full, and Lily was singing something from school under her breath in the unself-conscious way of children who don't yet know that singing in public requires justification. He dropped her at the front entrance. She'd hugged him around the middle right side, always the right side now. She'd calibrated to it without and gone up the steps with her backpack listing to the left the way it always did, because she never distributed the weight evenly, no matter how many times he reorganized it. He'd watched her go through the doors. Then he'd driven to the hospital. The surgeon, a precise and unsentimental man named Dr. Okafor, who had operated on Ethan's shoulder twice before and had the manner of someone who has long ago made peace with patients who do not follow post-operative instructions, reviewed the imaging and said, "You tore the repair from the second surgery almost completely. I'm going to fix it, and then you are going to do exactly what I tell you, or the third repair will be the last one I'm willing to do." "Understood," Ethan said. "I mean it this time." "I know. You said that after the second one." The circumstances were different this time. Okafor had looked at him, over his reading glasses, with the expression of a man who has heard this before and found it approximately as persuasive as the previous times. "They're always different," he said. "The shoulder doesn't care." The surgery went well, which was Okafor's word for it, well delivered in the flat tone of a person reporting a satisfactory outcome without endorsing the chain of events that made it necessary. Ethan woke up in the recovery room, assessed the ceiling. He confirmed his name when asked, and spent the next hour being gradually returned to full consciousness while a television in the corner played a morning talk show with the volume low enough to be unintelligible. His phone had a text from Shaw Vosserain this morning. "Keller cooperating fully. The chain holds. Get some rest." And one from Vivian, sent at 7:42, while he'd been in prep. "Sophie ate breakfast this morning. Real breakfast, not just toast. First time since the garage. Thought you should know." He read that one twice. Then he put the phone down and closed his eyes and let the anesthesia finish wearing off in its own time. Recovery was slower than he wanted it to be, and faster than Okafor had predicted, which put it somewhere in the range of accurate for Ethan's general relationship with medical timelines. He was home by the afternoon of the surgery day, under strict instruction to do nothing that required his left arm, which eliminated a surprising number of activities and made him understand, with new concreteness, how much of daily life is a two-handed operation. Lily took the situation very seriously. She reorganized the refrigerator so that everything Ethan might want was on the lower shelves within easy right-handed reach, moved several things to locations that made no organizational sense, but which he did not rearrange, because the intent behind it was the kind of thing you didn't correct. She brought him things he hadn't asked for: a glass of water, his book, the television, remote, with the purposeful air of a person who has identified a role and is executing it thoroughly. "You don't have to wait on me," he told her, on the second day. She said, "I want to." She paused. "Mrs. Peterson says when someone's hurt, you take care of them." "Mrs. Peterson is correct." "I know," Lily said again, with the serenity of a child who has access to reliable sources. He spent the first week doing what he almost never did, which was very little. He slept more than usual, because the medication made it easy, and Okafor had been specific about sleep being part of the repair process, a fact that Ethan filed under things I know are true and usually ignore. He talked to Shaw twice daily, reviewed documents, one-handed on his laptop, and answered Vivian's messages, which came with a regularity that suggested she was also doing something she didn't usually do, which was checking in on someone without a specific operational reason. The messages were not long. She was not a person who padded things out, but they came consistently a detail about the federal case, an update on Sophie, occasionally something with no professional content at all, like a photograph of the view from her office window, on a morning when the city was doing something interesting with fog and light, sent without explanation or caption, which he looked at for a moment and then set his phone face down and went back to his book. On the fourth day, Sophie called him. He almost didn't recognize the number Vivian's cell, which Sophie had apparently commandeered and picked up expecting Vivian. "Hi," Sophie said. "Sophie," he sat up slightly. "Everything okay?" "Mom said I could call." A pause. "I wanted to ask you something. Do you have a dog?" He blinked. "Why?" "Told my friend at school about you and she asked if you had a dog, and I didn't know." Another pause. "She said all the really brave people on TV have dogs." "Have a 6-year-old, Ethan said. "Does that count?" Sophie seemed to consider this seriously. "Maybe." "What's her name?" "Is she nice?" "She reorganized my refrigerator for me." "That's nice," Sophie decided. Mom reorganizes things when she's worried about something. He didn't say anything to that because he wasn't sure what there was to say that wouldn't be more than a phone call between a grown man and an 8-year-old needed to carry. "My therapist says I should do normal things," Sophie said. "So I went back to school yesterday." "How was it?" "Weird. Everyone was nice to me," which was nice but also weird, because usually Maya Chen is not that nice to me, and when she's extra nice, it means she wants something. A pause. But she was actually nice this time. So maybe she just felt bad. "People feel bad when something happens to someone they know," Ethan said. "Even if they're not always nice in regular life." That's what Mom said too. Sophie was quiet for a moment. "I'm not scared in the bathroom anymore." He understood what she meant. "Good. I counted to 412 that night," she said. "In the bathroom. When you were in the stairwell." He sat with it for a moment. 412. An 8-year-old alone in a bathroom counting her way through fear, while adults dealt with the machinery of it on the other side of the door. He didn't say it was brave, because she'd heard that word a lot, and it had started to mean something performed rather than something real. "That's a lot of numbers," he said. "I know. I didn't want to stop because stopping felt like giving up." "Stopping wouldn't have been giving up," he said. "But keeping going was the right call." She said, "Then, can I meet Lily sometime?" Mom said maybe. Mom said maybe? She said it depends on logistics. What logistics means. It means yes. But with scheduling, Ethan said. Sophie seemed satisfied with that. They talked for another 3 minutes about nothing particularly important about her school, about the book she was reading, whether fish could feel emotions, which was apparently a point of ongoing debate in her class. And then she said she had to go, because dinner was ready, and hung up with the abrupt efficiency of a child who has gotten the thing they called for and sees no reason to extend the transaction. Ethan sat with the phone in his hand for a moment after she hung up. 412. He put the phone down and went to tell Lily that dinner needed to happen because the medication had made him forget to eat again, and that was a thing Okafor had specifically told him not to do. The federal case against Damien Voss moved with the methodical momentum of something that had been built from the foundation. Slowly at first, with increasing speed as the evidence structure became too solid for legal maneuvering to find gaps in Zo. Keller's cooperation had been the turning point. He gave them the chain of instruction with a thoroughness that suggested he had arrived at the conclusion that his best available future required making himself as useful as possible, and the documents he provided closed the interpretive spaces that Voss's defense team had been counting on. Shaw called Ethan on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the surgery, while Lily was at her appointment, and Ethan was in the parking lot reading, because there was nothing else to do, and he'd finished the chapter he'd been on for 6 days. "It's done," Shaw said. Ethan closed the book. "Voss pleaded this morning. His lawyers told him the trial math wasn't favorable, and he listened, eventually." A pause. conspiracy, kidnapping facilitation, corporate espionage. He's going to be an old man before he has options again. Ethan sat in the parked car and looked out the windshield at a parking lot that was entirely ordinary other cars. A tree that had lost most of its leaves. A woman walking a dog that was pulling towards something on the ground with the laser focus of a dog that has found something it considers important. Team from the garage, Ethan asked. Sentenced last week. The leader got the most. The others arranged cooperation factored in for 2 of them. Shaw paused. The man from the stairwell. Your stairwell, he got 7 years. His lawyer tried the argument. That he was following contracted instruction and didn't know the full scope. Judge was not receptive. And Pierce? Cooperating extensively. Reduced sentence in exchange. He's not a brave man, which turned out to be useful. Ethan nodded, though Shaw couldn't see it. Keller. 8 years. Could have been more. He gave them enough that the prosecutors honored the cooperation agreement. Shaw was quiet for a moment. He'll be out in his mid-50s, with a felony record and no career. Another pause. For what it's worth, when the judge read the verdict, he looked, I don't know, relieved. More like he finally understood the full weight of what he'd traded. A board seat, Ethan said. A board seat, Shaw confirmed. Some people have a very expensive kind of pride. Through the windshield, the dog had gotten whatever it had been after, and was now trotting along contentedly. Its owner, resigned, followed. How's the shoulder? Shaw asked. Okafor says good progress. That's not what I asked. It's improving, Ethan said. The physical therapy is he stopped. It's annoying, he said, because that was more accurate. Shaw made a sound that was probably a suppressed laugh. Vivian asked me the same thing yesterday. She asks me directly, Ethan said. Also asks me. I think she wants confirmation that you're not lying to her. A pause. Are you lying to her? About the shoulder? No. It's improving. I'm doing what Okafor said. Genuinely, mostly. That's the most honest thing you've said about your medical care since I've known you, Shaw said. I'll take it. A longer pause. This was good work, Ethan. What you did in that building. All of it, the investigation, the stairwell, the relocation. Good work. He didn't say thank you, because Shaw wasn't a man who needed it, and they both knew it. You ran a clean investigation, he said instead. The evidence held because you built it right. Mutual Appreciation Society, Shaw said dryly. But very out of character for both of us. He cleared his throat. I'll send you the final case summary when it's processed. For your records. Appreciated. And Ethan. A final pause. The kind Shaw used when he was going to say something he'd been deciding whether to say. Whatever's happening between you and Vivian Marlowe, I don't know what it is, and I'm not asking. But from the outside, it looks like 2 people who are both terrible at saying what they mean, trying to figure out how to start. He paused again. For what it's worth. Ethan looked at the parking lot. That's unusually personal for you, Shaw. It's been an unusually personal case, Shaw said. Take care of the shoulder. He hung up. Lily came out of the appointment, 12 minutes later, already talking, before she reached the car door. Something about a sticker chart and the relative merits of different sticker types. Conversation that required no particular input from Ethan, but which reorganized his thinking entirely. Yet, in the way Lily's conversations always did, by filling all available space with something immediate and concrete, and completely uninterested in the weight he'd been sitting with. He drove her home. He made dinner with one arm, which had become a kind of skill in itself. Told her that night that the people who'd needed helping were helped now, and it was done. She asked if they were okay. He said yes. She said good, and went back to her drawing. You was the end of it. Because Lily dealt with information the way she dealt with most things, absorbed it, confirmed it was not an emergency, and moved on. He had always admired that about her. It was not a quality she'd gotten from him. Vivian restructured the security department in January. It was 2 months after the garage and 6 weeks after Ethan had returned to work on a modified schedule that Okafor had approved with visible reluctance and a list of physical restrictions that Ethan kept on his desk and consulted more often than he would have predicted. The restructuring was not comfortable. Ethan had told her it wouldn't be, and he'd been right, and she hadn't pretended otherwise. 3 more people lost their positions not for complicity in what Keller and Pierce had done, but for the subtler failures that enabled it. access protocols that hadn't been reviewed in 4 years, compartmentalization that existed on paper and not in practice, a general culture of assuming that internal threats came from outside rather than from the people already inside. He walked her through each finding personally, sat across her desk and laid it out the same way every time. Here's what I found. Here's what it means. Here is what needs to change. Yes, he did not soften the ones that reflected poorly on decisions she had made before any of this happened. Because she had told she'd wanted it straight and she meant it, and he had seen enough of her by now to know that the worst thing he could do was give her a managed version of the truth. She was not always easy about it. There were 2 meetings where she pushed back in ways that were more about the difficulty of hearing it than about the substance of what he'd found. And he held his position both times without making it a confrontation. And both times she came back the next day with a version of "I know you're right" that she expressed as a practical decision rather than an admission, which was the Vivian Marlowe way of conceding a point and which he had learned to read correctly. In February, Sophie started coming to the office on Friday afternoons, while her regular nanny took a standing appointment, a logistical arrangement that Vivian had made without particularly announcing it. Sophie did homework in a conference room and occasionally appeared in Ethan's doorway with questions that were sometimes about homework and sometimes about other things. "Do you think fish can dream?" she asked one Friday in February, appearing in his doorway with a pencil behind her ear. "No," he said. "Probably something in between dreaming and not dreaming." "What does that mean?" "It means I don't know," he said. She seemed to find this acceptable and left. The following Friday, she asked him if he'd ever been really scared of something ordinary, meaning not kidnappers, but like spiders or the dark or something like that. And he said he used to be uncomfortable in very small spaces after a particular experience overseas that he wasn't going to go into detail about. And she said that was interesting. And he said she was a very strange kid. And she said her mom said the same thing but nicer. And he said her mom was being diplomatic. Sophie grinned. "She does that sometimes." "She's getting better at it," Ethan said. Sophie looked at him for a moment with her mother's evaluating eyes. Then she went back to her homework. Whitmore Capital holiday event happened on the 14th of December, which Ethan knew because it was on the company calendar, and because Vivian had mentioned it 3 times in the preceding month in the way of someone making sure a thing was on someone's radar without directly demanding their attendance. He brought Lily. This had not been discussed explicitly. He had simply arrived with her because the event was on a Friday evening and Lily's Friday sitter had a conflict and the alternative was not going, which he had decided at some point between November and December was not what he wanted. Lily wore a red dress with a sash that she'd picked herself and spent the car ride telling him about the girl from her Clyde over telling him about the girl from her class who also had a red dress and how they had made a plan to coordinate, and he was not sure when 6-year-olds started coordinating outfits with their friends, but apparently it was now. The event was in Whitmore Capital's main floor, which had been cleared and done up in the way that corporate holiday events are done up: tasteful, expensive, the kind of decorating that whispers rather than announces. Lily walked in beside him and immediately identified the dessert table from across the room, which suggested she had inherited no navigational instincts from him whatsoever. Sophie found them in approximately 4 minutes. She came through the crowd with the focused trajectory of a child who has a destination, stopped in front of Lich's, and assessed her with the direct appraisal of an 8-year-old performing an immediate social evaluation. Lily assessed her back. "You're Sophie," Lily said. "You're Lily," Sophie said. "Your dad talks about you. Your mom talks about you," Lily said. Then, as a follow-up, with the unerring instinct of a 6-year-old identifying the most important piece of information in any new environment, "Is that a real dessert table?" Sophie said. "There's chocolate fondue." Lily looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. "Go ahead," he said. They disappeared toward the dessert table with the perfect unity of 2 children who have identified a common priority and are not going to let adult supervision slow them down. He watched them go. Sophie, 2 years older and half a head taller, already pointing at something on the table that made Lily's eyes go wide. He stood there for a moment, just watching. Vivian appeared beside him. "Yes," he'd moaned. She had a glass of something sparkling, and she was in a dark blue dress that was different from her work clothes, in the way that said she'd given some thought to the distinction. And she stood beside him and looked at the same thing he was looking at. Chocolate fondue, she said. Apparently. Sophie's been talking about meeting her since October. He glanced at her. Since October, that's before you were even formally back on the payroll. Yes, Vivian said. Sophie decides things early. She gets that from somewhere. Diplomatic, he said. Vivian's mouth curved. She was better at the full smile now he'd noticed it happening more often over the past month. She still pulled it back sometimes. Old habit, but less than she used to. She seems fearless, Vivian said, watching Lily navigate the dessert table with complete confidence. She's not, Ethan said. She checks under her bed every night. She has a list of things she's afraid of. She's just decided that the list doesn't get to run her schedule. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She sounds like her father. She's better at it, he said. She doesn't have the part where it costs something. She just does it because it seems like the right call. She'll learn the cost eventually, Vivian said. Yeah, but not yet. He watched Lily accept a strawberry on a fondue stick from Sophie and bite into it with complete commitment. Yet is worth protecting. Vivian stood beside him, and they watched the girls at the dessert table, and the party moved around them. Conversation and laughter, and the gentle orchestral something playing through the building's sound system, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was fine. They'd gotten good at the silence, Ethan. Vivian said it without any particular setup. I want to say something I've been bad at saying. He waited. I was wrong about you, she said. Not wrong in the way of being mistaken about a professional assessment. Wrong in the deeper way, the way where I looked at a person and decided I'd already seen all there was to see and built a whole structure of behavior on top of that decision. She paused. My daughter is at a dessert table right now because you heard her in a parking garage on the worst professional morning of your life, and then you decided her safety mattered more than any of the completely reasonable things you could have done instead. She stopped. I don't know how to match that. I'm not sure it's matchable. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You don't have to match it. It's not a ledger. I know. But I want you to know I understand the size of it. What you are. What I almost... She stopped the same place she always stopped. What I almost cost us. He understood what the unfinished sentence held. I know you understand it, he said. You've understood it for a while. You didn't have to say it out loud. I wanted to, she said. For my own reasons. He looked at her sideways. She was looking at the girls, her expression quiet and honest in the way it had learned to be when she wasn't performing anything. Vivian, he said. Yeah, you're allowed to take credit for the things you did right, too. When I found the stairwell situation and called you, you didn't come. You stayed where I asked you to stay, which was the right call and cost you something to make. You rebuilt the security department the hard way instead of the comfortable way. You kept your word about Lily, every time, without qualification. He paused. Count. She looked at him then. The party continued behind them, indifferent, cheerful. I'm still learning to lead differently, she said. You're doing it. It's harder than I thought. Most things worth doing are, he said, which was true and also slightly obvious, but she didn't seem to mind. From across the room, Lily called out Daddy. There's caramel, with the urgency of a genuinely important announcement. He raised a hand to indicate he'd heard. Vivian laughed, actually laughed. The real version, not the professional one. It was a good sound. He'd heard it maybe 4 times in 3 years of working in the same building, and increasingly more often in the past 2 months, and each time it caught him slightly off guard in a way he'd stopped trying to explain to himself. She's wonderful, Vivian said. She really is, he said. They stood together and watched their daughters at the dessert table, Sophie showing Lily something about the fondue technique with the authority of a person 2 years older, who has been to more formal events and understands the mechanics. Lily listening with the focused attention she applied to things she decided were worth learning. 2 girls who had both been scared in specific ways and had gotten through it, and were now standing at a dessert table on a December evening arguing quietly and with great seriousness about whether white chocolate or dark chocolate was superior, which was the kind of argument that had a clear right answer that Ethan had opinions about. Case was closed. The people responsible were where they were supposed to be. The company was being rebuilt on sturdier foundations. Sophie was in therapy and eating real breakfasts and going back to school and asking philosophical questions about fish. Lily had a stick waiting at home for scratching under the sling and had reorganized the refrigerator and was currently acquiring a new friendship over fondue with the same easy confidence with which she approached everything she'd decided was worth her time. His shoulder ached in the cold of the building's entrance where they'd been standing slightly too close to the door, but it was the smaller ache of something genuinely healing rather than the larger ache of something torn. And Dr. Okafor had said at the last appointment that the repair was holding better than expected, which from Okafor was the surgical equivalent of a standing ovation. Vivian reached over and adjusted his jacket lapel slightly. It had turned in from the cold, or from how he was standing, and she reached over with the casual ease of a person who had crossed some invisible threshold in their own mind, about appropriate proximity without announcing that they'd crossed it, and fixed it, and then seemed to notice that she'd done it and did not appear to regret it, and he did not say anything about it. Small and remarkable from the outside. From the inside, it was something. He keened. He thought about what Shaw had said in the parking lot, two people who are both terrible at saying what they mean, trying to figure out how to start. Shaw was not wrong. As a general matter, about most things, and he was not wrong about this either. Whatever this was, between them, this arrangement that had started with a firing and a parking garage, and had accumulated through late nights and stairwells and honest conversations in quiet offices, it didn't have a name yet. Neither of them was going to force one on it. They were both own ways. People who trusted demonstrated behavior over stated intention. Yes, he'd intervened, and the behavior had been accumulating for 3 months in a direction that both of them understood without discussing it. Was enough for tonight. Across the room, Lily had progressed from the fondue to what appeared to be a serious evaluation of the cookie situation. Sophie beside her offering what looked like informed commentary. 2 kids at a dessert table. Nothing more, which was everything. Ethan had spent a long time in his life doing things that mattered at a scale that was invisible operations in places that didn't exist officially. Decisions made in the dark that protected people who never knew protection had been required. He had been good at it, and he had walked away from it, and he had never been entirely sure whether walking away had been the right call or whether he's on some level waiting to find out, cussed. He understood now that the question had been wrong. It wasn't about whether leaving was right. It was about what he'd walked toward. What he'd been building in the ordinary years since the Tuesday pancakes. The refrigerator reorganized by small hands. The books read in parking lots while waiting for appointments. The photograph worn soft at the corners from too much handling. People talked about the extraordinary things as though they were the point. Stairwell, the garage, the shoulder that refused to quit. Those were real, and they had mattered, and he didn't wish them undone. But they were the exception. They were the moments that proved what was true in all the other moments. The ordinary was the point. It was always the ordinary. Lily turned from the dessert table and found him across the room, the way she always found him in crowds, some parental radar running in both directions that neither of them had ever needed to think about. She waved once with the hand that wasn't holding a cookie, the uncomplicated wave of a child who is happy and wants her happiness to be visible. He raised his right hand back. She turned back to Sophie. And Ethan Rourke stood in a room full of people celebrating the end of a year, his shoulder healing. His daughter safe, Nunt, something new and careful, and not yet named, standing beside him in a blue dress. Yes, he'd intervened, and he understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has learned to trust the things he can see, that the version of the world he was standing in was the one that had been worth every cost of getting here. Perfect. Not uncomplicated. Not without the scars of what it had taken. Just real and present and his. Outside the building's tall windows, December snow had started to fall on the city, the first snow of the season, fine and unhurried, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives, and covers everything in the same patient, indifferent white. Streets and rooftops and parked cars, and the one tree on the corner that had been bare since November, now outlined in something softer. The city going on, the way cities do. And inside, two girls at a dessert table, and a man who had finally, after a very long time, arrived somewhere he intended to stay.